In the tranquil shadows of Ashwood Manor, a single footprint lies in the dew-kissed grass, a silent witness to a brutal murder. When glamorous actress Geraldine Voss is found strangled in the rose garden, the secrets of a grand estate unravel. Who left that solitary mark? Was it the limping colonel hiding a heated argument, or the protective mother desperate to shield her daughter's future? A cryptic note, a smudge of ink, a whispered scandal. Each clue pulls Miss Jane Marple deeper into a web of lies. Can her little grey cells uncover the truth before another secret turns deadly? Chapter 1. The Tranquil Haven of Ashwood Manor. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over the rolling hills of the Devon countryside, bathing Ashwood Manor in a warmth that belied the chill of secrets nestled within its ivy-clad walls. The estate, a grand Georgian structure with tall windows and a perfectly symmetrical facade, stood as a monument to the quiet dignity of its owner, Sir Reginald Harcourt. It was the kind of place where time seemed to pause, where the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the rustle of leaves outside were the loudest disturbances. Yet, beneath this serene surface, a subtle unease simmered, as though the very air anticipated a disruption. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned wicker chair on the terrace, sipped her tea and observed the gathered company with her customary unobtrusive keenness. She had been invited to Ashwood Manor for a weekend gathering, a rare departure from her quiet life in St. Mary Mead. Sir Reginald, a widower of some 60 years, was known for his philanthropy and his impeccable taste in rare books, and it was the latter that had drawn Miss Marple's interest. She had heard whispers of a first-edition manuscript in his collection, a treasure that piqued her curiosity as much as the eclectic group assembled around her. The guests, a carefully curated circle, were a study in contrasts. There was Lady Beatrice Harcourt, Sir Reginald's younger sister, a woman of sharp wit and sharper tongue, whose elegant silk dress did little to soften her imperious demeanour. Her husband, Colonel Maurice Harcourt, sat beside her, his military bearing softened by a glass of brandy and a tendency to reminisce about campaigns in India. Their daughter, Clara Harcourt, a pale young woman of 25, fidgeted with her pearl necklace, her eyes darting nervously toward the house. Miss Marple noted the girl's unease with interest. It was not the restlessness of youth, but something deeper, something fearful. Across the terrace, Dr. Leonard Baxter, the local physician and a friend of Sir Reginald, puffed on a pipe, his round face creased with good humour. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way his fingers tightened around the pipe stem when Lady Beatrice spoke. Next to him lounged Geraldine Voss, a glamorous actress whose presence in this rural retreat seemed incongruous. Her laughter was bright, but Miss Marple observed, were calculating, scanning the group as if assessing a stage. Finally, there was Mr. Edmund Crane, a solicitor from London, whose quiet demeanour and precise speech suggested a man accustomed to guarding secrets. He had arrived only that morning, his briefcase never far from his side. The conversation flowed politely, touching on the weather, the harvest festival in the nearby village, and Sir Reginald's latest acquisition, a rare manuscript of the Canterbury Tales. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mind cataloguing every inflection, every glance. She had a way of blending into the background, her unassuming presence allowing others to forget the sharpness of her observation. It was a skill honed over years of village life, where gossip and human nature revealed truths far more intricate than any novel. As the afternoon waned, Sir Reginald himself emerged from the house, his silver hair catching the sunlight. He was a tall man, lean and distinguished, with an air of quiet authority. "My dear friends," he said, his voice warm but measured, "I trust you're enjoying the hospitality of Ashwood Manor. Tonight I have a special treat, a private viewing of the manuscript after dinner. I assure you it is a marvel." A murmur of excitement rippled through the group, though Miss Marple noted that Clara's face paled further and Mr. Crane's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. Lady Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Really, Reginald, must you flaunt your treasures so? One might think you're inviting trouble." Sir Reginald chuckled, but there was a flicker of something. annoyance perhaps in his eyes. "Nonsense, Beatrice. What trouble could find us here in this haven of peace?" Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. She had heard such assurances before, and they were often the prelude to something far less tranquil. Her gaze drifted to the lawn beyond the terrace, where a single footprint, stark and solitary, marred the dew-damp grass near the rose garden. It was an odd thing, that footprint, too deep for a casual step, too deliberate for a gardener's tread. She made a mental note of it, her mind already turning over possibilities. Dinner was a formal affair, served in the oak-panelled dining room, under the watchful eyes of Harcourt ancestors immortalized in oil paintings. The conversation turned to local matters, the vicar's new sermon, the upcoming village fete, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension. Clara barely touched her food, her eyes fixed on her plate. Geraldine Voss, seated beside Sir Reginald, was all charm, her anecdotes drawing laughter, though Miss Marple noticed how her hand lingered on Sir Reginald's arm. Dr. Baxter, meanwhile, seemed distracted, his gaze often straying to the window where the twilight deepened into night. As the meal concluded, Sir Reginald rose, clapping his house and hands. "To the library, my friends. The manuscript awaits." The group followed him through the grand hall, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The library was a cavernous room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and its air heavy with the scent of old paper. In the center, on a velvet-lined table, lay the manuscript, its pages yellowed but pristine. Sir Reginald's pride was evident as he described its history, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She was watching the guests, noting how Mr. Crane's fingers twitched as if longing to touch the pages, how Clara's breath hitched, and how Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed with something akin to resentment. It was then that a piercing scream shattered the stillness. The sound came from the direction of the rose garden, sharp and filled with terror. The group froze, their faces a tableau of shock. Sir Reginald was the first to move, striding toward the French doors that led to the garden. "Stay here," he commanded, but Miss Marple, with her deceptively sprightly step, followed close behind, her curiosity piqued. Outside, the night was cool and still. The rose garden, illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns, revealed a grim sight. Clara Harcourt stood trembling, her hands covering her mouth, staring at the ground. There, sprawled among the roses, lay Geraldine Voss, her glamorous beauty extinguished. Her throat bore the unmistakable marks of strangulation, and her eyes stared blankly at the stars above. Miss Marple's gaze, however, was drawn once more to the grass nearby. The single footprint she had noticed earlier was still there, undisturbed, its edges sharp in the moonlight. But now she saw something else. A second footprint, fainter, almost invisible, leading away from the body. It was a clue, subtle but undeniable, and Miss Marple's mind began to weave a pattern from the threads of this tragedy. "Mon Dieu," she murmured, though her tone was calm, her eyes alight with the spark of deduction. "The little gray cells, they are already at work." Chapter 2. The Shadow of Death. The rose garden, so serene in the afternoon light, now lay under a pall of dread. Geraldine Voss's lifeless form, surrounded by the delicate petals of Sir Reginald's prized roses, seemed an affront to the tranquility of Ashwood Manor. The guests, drawn by Clara's scream, gathered at the edge of the garden, their faces pale in the flickering lantern light. Miss Jane Marple stood slightly apart, her small figure almost invisible in the shadows, yet her eyes missed nothing. The tremor in Clara's hands, the rigidity of Colonel Harcourt's posture, the way Mr. Crane's gaze darted toward the house, as if seeking escape. Sir Reginald, his earlier composure fractured, knelt beside the body, his fingers hovering over Geraldine's wrist, as if hoping for a pulse. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "Strangled, by God. Who could have done this?" The physician pushed forward, his round face now grim. "Let me examine her," he said, kneeling beside Sir Reginald. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Miss Marple noted the slight shake in them as he confirmed the obvious. "Death by strangulation," he said, rising. "No more than an hour ago, I'd wager. The marks are fresh." Lady Beatrice, her silk shawl clutched tightly, let out a sharp breath. "An hour? We were all at dinner an hour ago. Surely no one could have slipped away unnoticed?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, but she said nothing, her mind already sifting through the evening's timeline. Dinner had begun at 7 o'clock precisely, as Sir Reginald was a stickler for punctuality. The meal had lasted until 8:30, when the group adjourned to the library. Yet Geraldine had excused herself just before dessert, claiming a headache. Miss Marple recalled the actress's departure. Her smile had been tight, her steps hurried. Had she gone to the garden then? And if so, who had followed her? Colonel Harcourt, his military instincts asserting themselves, took charge. "We must secure the area and call the police at once. Reginald, where's your telephone?" "In the study," Sir Reginald replied, his voice distant. He rose, his eyes lingering on Geraldine's body, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, grief perhaps, or guilt, in his expression before he turned away. As the group moved back towards the house, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the footprints in the grass. The first, deep and solitary, was near the body, its outline clear in the damp earth. The second, fainter, led towards the hedge that bordered the garden. She crouched, her knees surprisingly nimble for her age, and studied the prints. The deeper one was from a man's shoe, size 10 or 11, she estimated, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. The fainter print was smaller, perhaps a woman's, but it was too indistinct to be certain. She straightened, her mind cataloguing this detail alongside the others, the nervous glances, the strained silences. Inside, the atmosphere in the drawing room was thick with unease. Clara sat on a sofa, her face buried in her hands, while Lady Beatrice hovered over her, murmuring words of comfort that sounded more like commands. Mr. Crane stood by the fireplace, his briefcase now tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable. Dr. Baxter paced, muttering about the tragedy, while Sir Reginald spoke quietly into the telephone, summoning the local constable. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting resumed as if by instinct. To the untrained eye, she was merely an elderly spinster, absorbed in her wool, but her ears were attuned to every word, her eyes catching every gesture. She noted how Colonel Harcourt's hand rested on his wife's shoulder, a gesture of longing to open his briefcase. And she saw Clara's eyes, red-rimmed but dry, dart toward the door as if expecting someone or something. The arrival of Constable Pork, a stout man with a walrus moustache, brought a temporary shift in the room's tension. He was accompanied by a young sergeant who carried a notebook and a look of nervous determination. "Now, Sir Reginald," Pork began, his voice gruff but respectful. "I'll need to know exactly what happened. Who found the body?" "Clara did," Sir Reginald said, gesturing to his niece. "She screamed, and we all came running." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. I went to the garden for some air after dinner. I saw her lying there. I didn't touch her, I swear." Pork nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "And when did you last see Miss Voss alive?" "At dinner," Clara said, her voice trembling. "She left before dessert, said she wasn't feeling well." Miss Marple's needles paused. Clara's account matched her own recollection, but there was something in the girl's tone, a hesitation perhaps, that suggested more than simple shock. She filed this away, her mind turning to the timeline. Geraldine had left the dining room at approximately 8:15. Clara had found the body at 9 o'clock. 45 minutes was a narrow window, but not impossible for a determined killer. Pork turned to the group. Did anyone else leave the dining room during that time? A chorus of denials followed, though Miss Marple noted the slight delay in Mr. Crane's response, the way his eyes flickered towards Sir Reginald. "We were all together," Lady Beatrice said firmly. "No one left until we went to the library." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp. All together, she thought, except for Geraldine and whoever followed her. She made a mental note to inquire about the servants later. In a house like Ashwood Manor, they were often the unseen witnesses to its secrets. As Pork continued his questions, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the footprints. The deep one suggested a man, but the fainter one complicated matters. Was it a second person, or a clever attempt to mislead? And why had Geraldine gone to the garden alone? Miss Marple's experience in St. Mary Mead had taught her that people rarely wandered into dark gardens without purpose, especially not glamorous actresses accustomed to the spotlight. The constable's questioning was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. A maid, her face pale, announced the arrival of an unexpected guest. "Miss Marple," Sir Reginald said, turning to her with a strained smile,
commanding despite her simple attire. She was Miss Jane Marple's old acquaintance, Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, the famed mystery novelist whose flair for drama was matched only by her knack for stumbling into real-life mysteries. "Reginald, what's this I hear about a murder?" she exclaimed, her eyes wide. "I came for a quiet weekend, and now this." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Mrs. Oliver's arrival was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Her friend's intuition, though often chaotic, had a way of stirring the pot, and Miss Marple suspected that this case would require all the stirring it could get. As the room erupted into explanations, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the window, where the rose garden lay shrouded in darkness. The single footprint, she knew, held the key to this mystery. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had built her reputation on noticing the small things. And in her mind, the little grey cells were already piecing together the puzzle. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Insight. The drawing-room at Ashwood Manor buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind that follows a sudden tragedy when civility wars with suspicions. Constable Pork's broad frame filled the doorway as he conferred with his sergeant, their murmurs punctuated by the scratch of pencil on paper. The guests, scattered across the room like pieces on a chessboard, avoided each other's eyes, each absorbed in their own thoughts, or, Miss Jane Marple suspected, their own secrets. She sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, her serene expression masking the whirlwind of observation within. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver's arrival had stirred the group like a gust of wind through a still pond. Her theatrical exclamations about murder and her insistence on knowing every ghastly detail had briefly disrupted the sombre mood, but now she sat beside Miss Marple, her notebook open, scribbling ideas for what she called a perfectly dreadful novel. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the living characters before her than in Mrs. Oliver's fictional ones. She had noted the way Sir Reginald's shoulders stiffened at Mrs. Oliver's arrival, as if her presence was an unwelcome complication. She had seen, too, the flicker of relief in Clara's eyes, quickly masked by a return to her nervous fidgeting. Constable Pork cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. "I've telephoned for Inspector Crane from Exeter," he announced. "He'll be here by morning to take charge. Until then, I must ask you all to remain in the house. No one is to leave the premises, and the rose garden is off limits." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a blade. "This is outrageous, Constable. Are we to be treated as prisoners in my brother's home?" "Not prisoners, my lady," Pork replied. "Must ensure the scene is preserved." Colonel Harcourt snorted, his moustache twitching. "Preserved? The garden's trampled already. You'll find nothing but mud and roses out there." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes lifting briefly to the Colonel. His words were dismissive, but his tone carried a hint of urgency, as if he wished to steer attention away from the garden. She made a mental note of it, her thoughts returning to the footprint she had observed. The deeper one, so stark in the grass, suggested a deliberate act, but the fainter one intrigued her more. It was almost as if someone had tried to erase their presence, a subtlety that spoke of calculation. Mrs. Oliver leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice a stage whisper.
"Jane, this is simply too thrilling. A strangled actress in a rose garden. It's straight out of one of my books, though I'd have added a poisoned dagger for flair. What do you make of it?"
Miss Marple's smile was demure.
"I make very little of it, Ariadne, until I know more. But I am curious about Miss Voss. She was not, I think, a woman who wandered into gardens without purpose."
Mrs. Oliver's eyes gleamed.
"A rendezvous, you think? A lover? Or perhaps she was blackmailing someone? Oh, I must write this down."
Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was already turning over possibilities. Geraldine Voss had been a woman of charisma and ambition, the sort who drew attention and secrets like moths to a flame. Her presence at Ashwood Manor, a place so far removed from the London stage, suggested a motive beyond a simple weekend retreat. Had she come to meet someone, or to confront them? Sir Reginald, who had been silent since the constable's announcement, spoke at last. "I think we could all use some rest," he said, his voice strained. "This has been a dreadful shock. I'll have the maids prepare rooms for everyone." As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple caught Clara's arm gently. "My dear," she said, her voice soft but probing, "you must be terribly shaken. Tell me, when you found Miss Voss, did you notice anything unusual in the garden? Anything at all?" Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might speak, but then the girl's lips pressed together, and she shook her head. "Nothing," she whispered. "Just her." Miss Marple nodded, releasing her arm. The girl was hiding something, but fear, not guilt, seemed to drive her silence. Miss Marple's experience since Mary Mead had taught her to recognize the difference. She would need to tread carefully with Clara, coaxing the truth without alarming her further. As the guests retired to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her gaze drifting to the French doors that lit the thick carpet, and made her way to the library. The manuscript of the Canterbury Tales still lay on its velvet table, untouched since the evening's tragedy. She studied it for a moment, noting its pristine condition, then turned her attention to the room itself. The library was a treasure trove of potential clues, its shelves heavy with books, its corners filled with shadows. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small writing desk near the window, where a single sheet of paper lay half-concealed beneath a blotter. She lifted the blotter carefully, revealing a note in Geraldine Voss's elegant handwriting. "Meet me at 8:30. The Rose Garden. We must talk." The note was unsigned, but its implications were clear. Geraldine had arranged a meeting, and someone had kept it. Miss Marple tucked the note back under the blotter, a mind racing. The timeline was tightening. Geraldine had left dinner at 8:15, and the note suggested a meeting 15 minutes later. The murder had occurred within that narrow window, and the footprints in the garden were now more significant than ever.
She resolved to examine them again in the morning, when the light would reveal their secrets more clearly. As she returned to the drawing room, she found Mrs. Oliver waiting, her notebook now filled with scribbled theories. "Jane, you've got that look," Mrs. Oliver said, her eyes narrowing. "You've found something, haven't you?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Only a thread, Ariadne, but threads, you know, can lead to the most surprising patterns." She bid her friend good night and retired to her room, but sleep was far from her mind. The little grey cells, as she liked to call them, were at work, piecing together the fragments of this puzzle. The single footprint, the note, the nervous glances of the guests, all were threads in a tapestry that was only beginning to take shape. And Miss Marple, with her quiet determination, was determined to unravel it. Chapter 4. The Art of Observation. The morning sun rose over Ashwood Manor, casting long shadows across the dew-laden lawn and bathing the rose garden in a soft golden light. The house, however, remained cloaked in an atmosphere of unease, as if the very walls absorbed the tension of the previous night's tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood at her bedroom window, her sharp eyes fixed on the garden below. The footprints she had noted in the moonlight were still there, their outlines clearer now in the daylight. She made a mental note to examine them more closely. But first, she had other threads to pursue. Breakfast was a subdued affair, served in the dining room under the watchful gaze of the Harcourt ancestors' portraits. The guests, summoned by the clanging of the breakfast gong, gathered reluctantly, their faces etched with fatigue and suspicion. Sir Reginald, at the head of the table, made a valiant effort to maintain decorum, but his usual warmth.
Beatrice, seated opposite, cut her toast with precise, almost aggressive movements, while Colonel Harcourt buried himself in a newspaper, his eyes barely skimming the print. Clara, pale and silent, sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth. Dr. Baxter, usually jovial, was uncharacteristically quiet, his pipe unlit in his hand. Mr. Crane, the solicitor, ate methodically, his briefcase at his feet as if guarding a secret. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, oblivious to the tension, chattered about the plot of her latest novel, her voice a jarring contrast to the somber mood. Miss Marple, seated near the window, observed them all with her customary unobtrusiveness. Her knitting lay in her lap, a prop that allowed her to blend into the background while her mind catalogued every detail, the way Clara's fingers trembled around her teacup, the fleeting glance Mr. Crane cast toward Sir Reginald, the way Dr. Baxter's jaw tightened when Lady Beatrice spoke. She had seen such behaviors before in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in the smallest gestures. As the meal concluded, Inspector Crane arrived from Exeter, a tall, lean man with a no-nonsense air and a pair of piercing grey eyes. He was accompanied by Constable Polk, who seemed relieved to defer to his superior. The inspector wasted no time, gathering the household in the drawing room for questioning. "I understand this is a distressing time," he began, his voice clipped but courteous, "but a murder has been committed and I must have the facts. I'll speak to each of you in turn, starting with Miss Harcourt, who found the body." Clara's interview was brief but revealing. She repeated her story from the previous night. She had gone to the rose garden for air after dinner and found Geraldine Voss dead. Her voice quavered, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands twisted together, as if wringing out a truth she dared not speak. The inspector pressed her gently. Had she seen anyone else in the garden? Had she heard anything unusual? But Clara insisted she had not. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. The girl's eyes, wide and fearful, suggested she was holding something back. Next came Sir Reginald, who spoke with the weary dignity of a man burdened by tragedy. He confirmed the timeline of the dinner, noting that Geraldine had left at 8:15, claiming a headache. "She seemed herself earlier," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "Charming, as always. I can't imagine who would do this to her." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind noting the faint tremor in his voice when he spoke of Geraldine's charm. Had there been something more between them, she wondered, or was his grief merely that of a host? Lady Beatrice was next, her answers sharp and imperious. "I was at dinner the entire time," she declared. "As were we all except Miss Voss. If you're looking for a culprit, Inspector, you might start with the servants.
They're always lurking about, overhearing things they shouldn't."
Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Lady Beatrice's eagerness to deflect suspicion was telling, and her disdain for the servants suggested a motive of her own, perhaps a fear of what they might have seen. Colonel Harcourt followed, his military precision evident in his account. "I was with my wife and the others," he said. "Didn't leave the dining room until we went to the library. Damned shame about Miss Voss, but I barely knew her." His bluntness was convincing, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided Clara's, as if he feared what she might say. Dr. Baxter, questioned next, confirmed his examination of the body. "Strangulation, no doubt about it," he said, his voice steady but his hands fidgeting with his pipe. "Happened between 8 and 9, based on the body's condition. I was at dinner like the others." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, recalling his distraction the previous night. Was it merely shock, or something more? Mr. Crane was the last of the guests to be questioned, his responses measured and precise. "I remained in the dining room until we moved to the library," he said, his fingers resting lightly on his briefcase. "I had no reason to go to the garden." His calm was almost too perfect, Miss Marple thought, like a man who had rehearsed his lines. The inspector then turned to the servants, a small staff consisting of a butler, 2 maids, and a cook. Their alibis were consistent. They had been in the kitchen or serving during the critical time. The butler, a stoic man named Jenkins, mentioned that he had seen Geraldine pass through the hall toward the French doors at 8:15, but no one else had followed her, at least not through the main hall. As the interviews concluded, Miss Marple slipped away, her destination the rose garden. The sergeant guarding the area nodded respectfully as she approached, assuming her presence was harmless. She crouched beside the footprints, her eyes tracing their outlines. The deeper print, likely a man's, was unchanged, its heel worn in a way that suggested a heavy step. The fainter print, however, was more intriguing. It was smaller, possibly a woman's, and its edges were blurred as if the person had tried to tread lightly. Miss Marple's mind turned to the note she had found in the library. "Meet me at 8:30, the Rose Garden." The footprints suggested that Geraldine's meeting had indeed taken place, and that it had ended in murder. Returning to the house, Miss Marple found Mrs. Oliver in the library, poring over a map of the estate she had found among Sir Reginald's books. "Jane, look at this," she exclaimed. "The garden has a back gate to the woods. The killer could have slipped out that way." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the map. "Indeed, Ariadne, but I am more interested in who entered the garden, and why." Her gaze fell on the right,
where the note still lay hidden. She decided to leave it for now. The inspector would find it soon enough, and she preferred to work in the shadows for the moment. As she rejoined the group, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of possibilities. The footprints, the note, the alibis, all were pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. Geraldine Voss had been no random victim. Her death was a calculated act, born of secrets that lay buried in the hearts of those at Ashwood Manor. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to unearth them. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning at Ashwood Manor wore on, heavy with the weight of suspicion and the murmur of whispered conversations. The drawing room, where the guests had reconvened after Inspector Crane's initial interviews, was a study in strained civility. The clink of teacups and the rustle of newspapers did little to mask the unease that hung over the group like a fog. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fireplace with her knitting, appeared absorbed in her work, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The way Lady Beatrice's lips tightened when Clara spoke. The restless tapping of Dr. Baxter's fingers. The way Mr. Crane's gaze lingered on the door, as if anticipating an escape. Inspector Crane, methodical and unyielding, had taken over Sir Reginald's study as a temporary headquarters. He was now questioning the servants again, his voice carrying faintly through the closed door. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the dynamics among the guests. She had learned, through years of quiet observation in St. Mary Mead, that the truth often revealed itself in the unguarded moments between formal inquiries. The morning's revelations had pointed an accusing finger at an unlikely suspect. Jenkins, the butler. Constable Polk had discovered a silk scarf, stained with what appeared to be blood, hidden in the servants' quarters. The scarf embroidered with the initials G.V. was unmistakably Geraldine Voss's, and Jenkins had been seen near the rose garden earlier that evening, tending to a broken lantern. The constable, eager to make progress, had declared Jenkins the prime suspect, and the guests seized on this with a mixture of relief and indignation. "Really, it's always the help," Lady Beatrice said, her voice dripping with disdain as she stirred her tea. "They're forever eavesdropping, plotting. I've never trusted Jenkins. Far too quiet for my liking." Colonel Harcourt nodded, his moustache bristling. "Man's got no business skulking about the garden at night. Damned suspicious if you ask me." Clara, however, remained silent, her eyes fixed on her hands, which twisted nervously in her lap. Miss Marple noted the girl's discomfort, sensing that Clara's silence was not agreement but fear. Dr. Baxter, puffing on his pipe, offered a more measured opinion. "Jenkins has been with Sir Reginald for years. Seems a steady sort. Hard to
believe he'd turn to murder." Mr. Crane, as usual, said little, but his fingers tightened around the handle of his briefcase. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, her mind turning over the possibility that the scarf was too convenient a clue, placed to divert attention from the true culprit. In her experience, the most obvious suspect was rarely the guilty one. A lesson she had learned from countless village intrigues. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, never one to stay silent for long, leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Jane, this scarf business is nonsense. It's straight out of a bad detective novel. The butler, of all people. Far too obvious. I'd wager it's a plant meant to throw us off." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "You may be right, Ariadne. But we must consider why someone would wish to cast suspicion on Jenkins. It suggests a mind both cunning and desperate." Her thoughts returned to the footprints in the rose garden. The deep print, likely a man's, did not match Jenkins' shoes, which she had discreetly observed during breakfast. The butler wore polished brogues, size 9, with no noticeable wear on the heels. The garden print, however, was larger, with a distinct scuff on the heel, a detail that pointed elsewhere. The fainter print, possibly a woman's, remained a puzzle, its blurred edges suggesting a deliberate attempt to obscure the maker's identity. As the morning progressed, Inspector Crane summoned Jenkins for questioning, and the butler's absence gave the guests a chance to speculate further. Sir Reginald, who had been subdued since the discovery of the body, spoke up at last. "I can't believe Jenkins would do this," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. "He's been loyal for decades. But that scarf, it's troubling." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind sifting through the implications. The scarf, found so conveniently, was indeed troubling, not because it implicated Jenkins, but because it suggested someone was orchestrating the investigation's direction. She recalled the note in the library, still hidden under the blotter. "Meet me at 8:30, the Rose Garden."
Had Geraldine written it to Jenkins? Unlikely, given the formal nature of their interactions. The note pointed to a more intimate connection, one that had led to a fatal confrontation. Determined to test her suspicions, Miss Marple excused herself and slipped out to the rose garden, where the sergeant still stood guard. The footprints remained undisturbed, their outlines stark in the morning light. She crouched beside them, her eyes narrowing as she studied the deeper print. The wear on the heel was distinctive, suggesting a shoe worn unevenly, perhaps by someone with a slight limp. She thought garden.
Returning to the house, Miss Marple found Mrs. Oliver in the hall, her notebook overflowing with theories. "Jane, I've been thinking," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "What if Geraldine was blackmailing someone? An actress like her, she'd know everyone's secrets. Maybe she pushed too far and someone snapped." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "A possibility, Ariadne. Miss Voss was not, I think, a woman who lived quietly. But we must be careful not to leap to conclusions. The truth lies in the details, the scarf, the footprints, the note." Mrs. Oliver's eyes widened. "A note? You didn't tell me about a note?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Patience, my dear. All in good time." As they returned to the drawing room, Inspector Crane emerged from the study, his face grim.
"Jenkins denies any involvement," he announced. "Says he was in the kitchen all evening, and the maids corroborate his story. But that scarf is damning. I've sent it to Exeter for analysis."
The guests murmured, their relief tempered by doubt. Miss Marple, however, was unconvinced. The scarf was a distraction, a red herring designed to mislead. Her mind turned to the other guests, Sir Reginald's grief, Clara's fear, Lady Beatrice's sharpness, Colonel Harcourt's defensiveness, Dr. Baxter's unease, Mr. Crane's reticence. Each had a motive, she suspected, and each was hiding something. The key was to find the thread that connected them to Geraldine, and to that single telling footprint. As the inspector continued his inquiries, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The little grey cells were at work, piecing together the fragments of this intricate puzzle. The scarf might point to Jenkins, but the footprints told a different story, one that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. The afternoon at Ashwood Manor was oppressively still, the air thick with the scent of roses and the weight of unspoken suspicions. The guests, confined to the house by Inspector Crane's orders, moved restlessly between the drawing room and the library, their polite exchanges laced with an undercurrent of unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, seemed to blend into the faded chintz of the armchair, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, catching the flicker of a glance, the tightening of a jaw, the subtle shift of a posture. She had learned long ago in St. Mary Mead that the truth often lay in the smallest details, and today her attention was fixed on a single telling inconsistency. Inspector Crane had spent the morning methodically questioning the household, his notebook filling with alibis and contradictions. The discovery of Geraldine Voss's scarf in Jenkins's quarters had solidified his suspicion of the butler, but Miss Marple remained unconvinced. The scarf was anything but a distraction. Her mind returned to the footprints in the rose garden, the deep, deliberate print of a man's shoe and the fainter, almost ghostly trace that suggested another presence. These, she felt, were the true keys to the mystery, and she resolved to uncover their significance. As the guests gathered for luncheon, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a seemingly trivial exchange. Colonel Harcourt, attempting to lighten the mood, remarked on the weather, noting how the dry spell had left the garden paths unusually firm. "Not a bit of mud to be seen," he said, his voice gruff but cheerful. "Makes a change from trudging through the monsoon in Bengal." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on his words.
The garden paths were indeed dry, yet the footprints in the grass near the roses had been pressed into soft, dew-damp earth. The contrast was striking, an inconsistency that suggested the prints were not made casually, but with purpose, perhaps during the brief window of evening dew. She filed this away, her thoughts turning to the colonel himself. His slight limp, a relic of his military service, could account for the worn heel of the deeper print. But why would he have been in the garden, and who had left the fainter trace? After luncheon, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, where the manuscript of the Canterbury Tales still lay on its velvet table, a silent witness to the previous night's events. She had not forgotten the note she had found under the blotter. "Meet me at 8:30, the Rose Garden. We must talk." Its implications were clear. Geraldine had arranged a clandestine meeting, one that had ended in her death. But with whom? The note's elegant script suggested urgency, perhaps even desperation, and Miss Marple suspected it was tied to a secret Geraldine had uncovered. As she stood by the writing desk, her eyes fell on a small, overlooked detail, a faint smudge of ink on the blotter, barely visible against the green felt. She leaned closer, her glasses catching the light, and saw that it formed a partial word: trust. It was a curious thing, this smudge, and it stirred a memory of Geraldine's demeanour at dinner, her calculated charm, her lingering touch on Sir Reginald's arm. Had she been probing for information, perhaps about the manuscript or something more personal? Miss Marple's mind turned to Sir Reginald's evident grief, his strained composure. Could he have been the intended recipient of the note? Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, her notebook clutched like a talisman. "Jane, this place is positively crawling with motives," she declared, her voice a mix of excitement and frustration. "I've been watching them all. Clara's terrified, Lady Beatrice is furious, and that Solicitor Crane is—"
"Much, Ariadne. But you must focus on the details. A smudge of ink, a footprint, a word overheard. These are the threads that weave the truth." Mrs. Oliver's eyes widened. "A smudge of ink? Oh, Jane, you're onto something, aren't you? Tell me!" But Miss Marple only shook her head, her expression serene. "Patience, my dear. The puzzle is not yet complete." Determined to test her observations, Miss Marple made her way to the rose garden, where the sergeant still stood guard. The footprints remained undisturbed, their outlines sharp in the afternoon light. She crouched beside them, her eyes tracing the deeper print's worn heel. It was a man's shoe, size 10 or 11, and the wear suggested a habitual gait, perhaps someone who favored one leg. Colonel Harcourt's limp came to mind again, but so did Dr. Baxter's heavy tread, observed during breakfast when he paced the dining room. The fainter print, however, was more elusive. Its blurred edges suggested a lighter step, perhaps a woman's, but the grass was too trampled to be certain. Miss Marple straightened, her mind turning over possibilities. Had two people been present at the murder, or was the fainter print a deliberate misdirection? As she returned to the house, she encountered Clara in the hall, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple," the girl said, her voice barely a whisper. I need to speak with you. Alone." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind was alert. "Of course, my dear. Shall we walk in the conservatory? It's quiet there." In the glass-walled conservatory, surrounded by potted ferns and the faint scent of earth, Clara's composure crumbled. "I lied to the inspector," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I did see something in the garden last night. Not a person, but a shadow, moving near the hedge just before I found her. I was too afraid to say." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained gentle. "A shadow, you say? Can you describe it?" Clara shook her head, her hands twisting together. "It was too dark, but it moved quickly, toward the back gate. I thought it might be nothing, just my imagination. But now I'm not sure." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand, her mind racing. The back gate, as Mrs. Oliver had noted, led to the woods, a perfect escape route for a killer. But Clara's fear suggested she knew more than she was saying. Was she protecting someone? Or was she simply too frightened to face the truth? Miss Marple resolved to watch her closely, for the girl's confession, though incomplete, was a crack in the facade of Ashwood Manor's secrets. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connection. Were working overtime, and she was determined to follow their lead. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Ashwood Manor, casting long shadows across the drawing room where the guests sat in uneasy silence. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish, but beneath the surface of this genteel setting, a current of suspicion ran strong. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the group with her usual unobtrusive keenness. The little grey cells, as she liked to call them, were piecing together the fragments of the mystery, and Clara's whispered confession in the conservatory had added a new thread to the tapestry. Inspector Crane had returned from his interviews with the servants, his expression more grim than before. The analysis of Geraldine Voss's scarf sent to Exeter had confirmed the presence of blood, though whether it was hers remained uncertain. Jenkins, the butler, remained under suspicion, but the maid's unwavering support of his alibi, that he had been in the kitchen from 8 to 9, had introduced doubt. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the guests than the butler. The scarf, she suspected, was a distraction, and the true clues lay in the subtle contradictions of those around her. As the group awaited the inspector's next move, Lady Beatrice broke the silence, her voice sharp with indignation. "This is intolerable," she declared, her silk shawl slipping from her shoulders. "To be confined like common criminals in my own brother's home. Reginald, you must speak to this inspector and demand he release us." Sir Reginald, seated by the fireplace, looked up from his untouched tea, his face etched with fatigue. "Beatrice, the man is doing his job. A woman has been murdered. We must cooperate." "Cooperate?" Colonel Harcourt snorted, his moustache twitching. "The police are barking up the wrong tree with Jenkins. The man's loyal as a hound. You'd do better to look at that solicitor fellow, always clutching that briefcase like it's full of secrets." Mr. Crane, who had been silently reading a legal document, looked up, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "I assure you, Colonel, my briefcase contains only papers related to Sir Reginald's affairs. I have no secrets to hide." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Mr. Crane. His composure was admirable, but she had seen such calmness before, in those who had rehearsed their innocence. She recalled his brief hesitation during the inspector's questioning, the way his fingers twitched toward his briefcase. What was he guarding so closely? And why had he arrived at Ashwood Manor only hours before the murder? Before the conversation could escalate, Clara rose abruptly, her face pale. I need some air," she stammered, hurrying toward the French doors. Lady Beatrice called after her, but the girl was already gone, her footsteps
echoing in the hall. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, who had been scribbling furiously in her notebook. "Poor thing's a wreck," Mrs. Oliver whispered. "Jane, she knows something, doesn't she? I can feel it. My intuition's never wrong." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Intuition is a fine thing, Ariadne, but it must be tempered with observation. Clara is frightened, yes, but fear can stem from many sources: guilt, knowledge, or simply the weight of suspicion." Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple followed Clara at a discreet distance, her steps light on the polished floor. She found the girl in the conservatory, standing among the ferns, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Miss Marple approached gently, her voice soft. "My dear, you must not carry this burden alone. Whatever you saw in the garden, it may be the key to finding justice for Miss Voss." Clara turned, her eyes wide with fear.
I can't, she whispered. If I tell, it'll ruin everything. You don't understand what's at stake.
Miss Marple's expression was kind but firm.
I understand more than you might think, Clara. In my village I have seen many secrets come to light, often to the relief of those who held them. Tell me what you know and let me help.
For a moment, Clara seemed on the verge of speaking, but then her resolve crumbled.
It's about Father,
she said at last, her voice barely audible.
He wasn't in the dining room the whole time. I saw him leave just after Geraldine did. He said he was going to the study for a cigar, but I don't know where he really went.
Miss Marple's mind raced, though her face remained serene. Colonel Harcourt's absence from the dining room was a significant revelation, one that aligned with the deeper footprint in the garden. His limp, the worn heel, she could almost see the pattern forming. But Clara's fear suggested more than a simple alibi discrepancy. Was she protecting her father, or was there another layer to her confession? Before Miss Marple could press further, the conservatory door opened, and Dr. Baxter appeared, his round face flushed. "Miss Harcourt, your mother's looking for you," he said, his tone brusque. He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting."
Not at all,
Miss Marple replied, her voice mild.
I was merely offering Clara some comfort. These are trying times.
As Clara hurried away, Miss Marple noted Dr. Baxter's unease, the way his fingers fumbled with his pipe, the quick glance he cast toward the garden. Had he overheard their conversation? Or was he, too, hiding something? She recalled his distraction at dinner, his gaze fixed on the window. Had he seen something, or someone, in the garden? Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Mrs. Oliver deep in conversation with Sir Reginald, who was describing the history of the Canterbury
Tales manuscript. "It's worth a fortune," he said, his voice tinged with pride. "But more than that, it's a piece of history. Geraldine was fascinated by it. She asked to see it privately yesterday." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Geraldine's interest in the manuscript was a new detail, one that suggested a motive beyond romance or blackmail. Had she been after the manuscript itself? Or was it a pretext for something else? The note in the library, the ink smudge, the footprints, all were beginning to converge, pointing to a web of secrets that centered on Ashwood Manor's treasures, both material and human. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the timeline. Geraldine had left the dining room at 8:15, followed, according to Clara, by Colonel Harcourt. The note had specified a meeting at 8:30, and Clara had found the body at 9. The window was narrow, but it allowed for a calculated act. The deeper footprint with its worn heel suggested a man, perhaps the Colonel, but the fainter print hinted at a second presence. Miss Marple's mind lingered on Lady Beatrice, whose sharp tongue and imperious demeanour might mask a deeper involvement. Or perhaps Mr. Crane, with his guarded briefcase, held the key. The little grey cells were at work, weaving a pattern from these threads. Miss Marple knew that the truth was close, but it required one more push, a revelation that would crack the facade of Ashwood Manor's polite society, and she was determined to find it. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The atmosphere in Ashwood Manor had grown taut as a violin string, each guest moving with the careful precision of someone aware they were being watched. The late afternoon light, slanting through the tall windows of the drawing room, cast long shadows that seemed to mirror the secrets lurking within the house. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, observed the group with her usual quiet intensity. The little grey cells were working tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of the mystery, Clara's confession about her father's absence, the footprints in the rose garden, the note under the library blotter, and the smudge of ink that hinted at a deeper motive. But it was the emotional undercurrents, Miss Marple knew, that often broke a case wide open.
The guests were restless, their nerves frayed by Inspector Crane's relentless questioning and the oppressive confinement of the manor. Jenkins, the butler, had been released from immediate suspicion after the maid's alibis held firm, but the discovery of Geraldine Voss's scarf had left a lingering cloud over the household. The inspector, frustrated by the lack of progress, had announced his intention to re-interview everyone after tea, and the prospect had set tongues wagging and tempers flaring. Lady Beatrice, her composure cracked.
She snapped, her teacup clattering against its saucer. "Reginald, how long must we endure this inquisition? The police are wasting time on Jenkins when the real killer is likely halfway to London by now." Sir Reginald, his face drawn, shook his head. "Beatrice, we must let the inspector do his work. Geraldine deserves justice." "Justice?" Lady Beatrice's voice rose, sharp and brittle. "What justice is there when we're all treated like suspects? I saw nothing, I know nothing, and yet I'm trapped here like a common criminal." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes noting the flush in Lady Beatrice's cheeks, the way her hands trembled despite her defiant tone. The woman's anger, she suspected, was a mask for something deeper, fear, perhaps, or guilt. Colonel Harcourt, seated beside his wife, placed a hand on her arm, but his gesture was stiff, almost reluctant. "Calm yourself, Beatrice," he said, his voice low. "You're making a scene." Clara, who had been silent since her confession to Miss Marple, flinched at her mother's outburst. Her eyes darted towards the French doors, as if longing to escape to the garden where Geraldine's body had been found. Miss Marple watched her closely, sensing that the girl was teetering on the edge of a revelation. Clara's fear of her father's involvement was palpable, but there was something else, something she had not yet dared to voice. Dr. Baxter, puffing on his pipe, attempted to diffuse the tension. "We're all on edge," he said, his tone conciliatory. "But we must trust the police to sort this out. Geraldine was, well, she was a vibrant woman. It's a tragedy." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the doctor. His words were kind, but his eyes were guarded, and she recalled his distraction at dinner, his gaze fixed on the window. Had he seen the shadow Clara described? Or was he hiding a more personal connection to the victim? Mr. Crane, as usual, remained silent, his briefcase at his side, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tapped rhythmically against its handle, a sign of nerves, perhaps, or impatience. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, never one to let a moment of drama pass, leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice a stage whisper. "Jane, this is it. The breaking point. Someone's going to crack. I can feel it. My intuition's screaming that Lady Beatrice is hiding something. Did you see her face?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "I see many things, Ariadne, but we must be patient. The truth reveals itself when the heart can no longer bear the weight of deception." Her words proved prophetic. As the group rose to move to the dining room for tea, Clara suddenly stood, her face ashen. "I can't do this any more," she cried, her voice. A gasp rippled through the room. Lady Beatrice's face drained of colour, and Colonel Harcourt's hand froze on his cane.
"Clara, what are you saying?"
he demanded, his voice hoarse.
"You're mistaken, girl. I was in the study."
But Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks.
"I saw you, Father. You were near the hedge, and you were arguing with someone. I couldn't hear the words, but you were angry. And then I found Geraldine."
The silence that followed was deafening. Sir Reginald's cup clattered to the floor, and Dr. Baxter's pipe fell from his hand. Mr. Crane's fingers stilled on his briefcase, and Lady Beatrice let out a strangled cry. "Clara, stop this nonsense at once!" she snapped, but her voice trembled, betraying her fear. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained serene. Clara's revelation was a turning point, a crack in the facade of Ashwood Manor's polite society. The Colonel's presence in the garden aligned with the deeper footprint, its worn heel matching his limping gait. But the fainter print, the note, the ink smudge, these suggested a more complex picture. Had the Colonel been alone? Or had someone else been present? And what had driven him to argue with Geraldine? Inspector Crane, alerted by the commotion, entered the room, his grey eyes sharp with interest. "Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "you'd better explain yourself. What exactly did you see?" Clara, trembling, repeated her story, her words halting but clear. The inspector's gaze shifted to Colonel Harcourt, who stood rigid, his face a mask of indignation. "This is preposterous," he said. "I went to the study for a cigar, as I told you. Clara must have seen someone else." But Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his hand gripped his cane. The Colonel was shaken, and Clara's tears suggested she believed her accusation, even if it pained her. The room was a powder keg, and Miss Marple knew that one more spark could ignite the truth. As the inspector began questioning the Colonel, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the note in the library. "Meet me at 8:30, the Rose Garden." Clara's account placed her father in the garden at roughly that time, but the fainter footprint suggested another presence. Lady Beatrice's reaction, her fury masking fear, hinted at her own involvement, perhaps as an accomplice or a witness. And then there was Mr. Crane, whose silence was as telling as any outburst. The smudge of ink, the word trust, these were clues to a motive that went beyond a simple argument. Miss Marple's knitting resumed its steady rhythm, but her mind was far from calm. The little grey cells were weaving a pattern, and Clara's confession had brought it into sharper focus. The truth was close now, but it required one final push, a confrontation that would force the guilty to reveal themselves. And Miss Marple, with her quiet determination, was ready to orchestrate it. Chapter 9. The Trap. The drawing room at Ashwood Manor was a crucible of tension, the air thick with the aftermath of Clara's tearful accusation. Colonel Harcourt's denial hung heavily, his protestations of innocence met with skeptical glances from the other guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her characteristic calm. But her mind was alight with the little grey cells working in overdrive. Clara's revelation had shifted the dynamics of the group, exposing cracks in their carefully maintained facades. Now Miss Marple knew was the moment to apply pressure, to set a trap that would coax the truth from the shadows. Inspector Crane, his grey eyes sharp, had taken Clara's statement seriously, and his focus on Colonel Harcourt was unrelenting. "You say you were in the study, Colonel," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Yet your daughter places you in the Rose Garden, arguing with someone moments before Miss Voss was found dead. Can you explain this discrepancy?" The Colonel's face reddened, his mustache twitching with indignation. "My daughter is mistaken," he snapped. "It was dark, and she was upset. I went to the study for a cigar, as I've said. Ask Jenkins. He saw me pass through the hall." Jenkins, standing silently by the door, nodded. "I did see the Colonel, sir, around 8:20. He was heading toward the study." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes noting the butler's measured tone. Jenkins's confirmation was plausible, but it did not rule out the Colonel's presence in the garden later. The timeline was tight. Geraldine had left dinner at 8:15. The note had specified a meeting at 8:30, and Clara had found the body at 9. The Colonel could have slipped out to the garden after passing through the hall, his limp leaving the deep footprint with its worn heel. But the fainter print, the smudge of ink, the word trust, these suggested a second player in this deadly game. Lady Beatrice, her composure fraying, rose to her husband's defense. "This is outrageous," she cried, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Clara is overwrought, imagining things. My husband had no reason to harm that woman. You should be questioning that solicitor, Mr. Crane, with his secretive briefcase, or even Dr. Baxter, who was so quick to examine the body." Dr. Baxter flushed, his pipe nearly slipping from his fingers. "I was merely doing my duty as a physician," he protested. "I had no more connection to Miss Voss than anyone else here." Mr. Crane, as always, remained silent, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his grip on his briefcase. His calm was a mask, she suspected, hiding a motive tied to the manuscript or perhaps to Geraldine herself. Sir Reginald, meanwhile, sat slumped in his chair, his grief palpable, but tinged with something Miss Marple could not yet name. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, sensing the rising tension, leaned towards Miss Marple, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Jane, this is it. The moment the killer slips, I can feel it. Someone's going to say something they regret." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Indeed, Ariadne, but we must guide them to it. A little pressure, applied in the right place, can unravel even the tightest knot." With this in mind, Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding attention despite its unassuming appearance. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "might I suggest we gather everyone in the library? There is something I believe we should discuss. A small detail that may shed light on this tragedy." The inspector, though surprised, nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple. If you have something to contribute, I'm all ears." The group filed into the library, their footsteps heavy with apprehension. The Canterbury Tales manuscript lay on its velvet table, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Miss Marple stood near the writing desk, her eyes briefly resting on the blotter where the note lay hidden. She had chosen not to reveal it yet. The timing was not right. Instead, she turned to the group, her expressions serene, but her words carefully chosen. "My friends," she began, "a murder has been committed, and the truth lies not in grand gestures, but in the smallest details. I have observed much in this house, and I believe we are close to understanding what happened to Miss Voss. But first, I must ask, did anyone here have reason to meet her in the rose garden last night?" The question hung in the air, met with a chorus of denials. But Miss Marple's eyes were on Clara, whose face paled, and on Colonel Harcourt, whose hand tightened on his cane. She continued, her voice soft but probing. A note was written, arranging a meeting at 8:30. Someone kept that appointment, and someone ensured Miss Voss would never speak of it. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Please, let us consider the facts. Miss Voss left dinner at 8:15, claiming a headache. Colonel Harcourt, you were seen in the hall shortly after, heading toward the study. Yet, Clara saw you." "Inspector." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, though her mind was racing. Sir Reginald's confession was a breakthrough, but it was incomplete. The deeper footprint matched the Colonel's limp, not Sir Reginald's steady gait, and the fainter print suggested another presence. Had Sir Reginald been in the garden with someone else, or was he protecting someone? Inspector Crane seized the moment. "Sir Reginald, you're admitting to meeting Miss Voss in the garden at 8:30? "Yes," Sir Reginald said, his voice breaking, "but I swear I left her alive. She was angry but unharmed. I went back to the house through the back gate."
Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The back gate, Clara's shadow, Sir Reginald's story aligned with the timeline. But it left gaps. The fainter footprint, the ink smudge, the word trust, these pointed to a deeper conspiracy. She suspected Sir Reginald was shielding someone, perhaps out of loyalty or fear. The trap had been set, and the guilty party was close to revealing themselves. All it would take was one more push. As the inspector pressed Sir Reginald for details, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the library desk, the note, and the smudge of ink. The truth was within reach, and she was determined to grasp it before the day was out. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The library at Ashwood Manor was a stage set for revelation, its oak-panelled walls and towering bookshelves bearing witness to the unravelling of a deadly mystery. The guests, gathered at Miss Jane Marple's request, stood or sat in a tense semicircle around the velvet-draped table where the Canterbury Tales manuscript lay. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting a golden glow that contrasted sharply with the sombre mood. Miss Marple, her small figure unassuming yet commanding, stood near the writing desk, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes, bright with the clarity of insight, surveyed the group as she prepared to lay bare the truth. Inspector Crane, his notebook in hand, watched her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Sir Reginald's confession that he had met Geraldine Voss in the rose garden to discuss the manuscript had shifted the investigation, but it had not closed it. The deeper footprint, the fainter one, the note, the ink smudge, all pointed to a more intricate plot. Miss Marple, with her little grey cells in full motion, was ready to weave these threads into a coherent pattern. "My friends," she began, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority, "a murder has been committed, and the truth lies not in the obvious but in the subtle. Miss Voss was no random victim. Her death was a calculated act, born of secrets that intertwine the lives of those in this room. Let us reconstruct—"
Beatrice's barely contained fury, Colonel Harcourt's rigid posture, Clara's trembling hands, Dr. Baxter's nervous fidgeting, and Mr. Crane's guarded silence. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, her notebook clutched tightly, leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Miss Voss left the dining room at 8:15, Miss Marple continued, claiming a headache. But she had written a note, found under this very blotter, arranging a meeting in the rose garden at 8:30. The note read, 'Meet me at 8:30, the rose garden. We must talk.' It was a summons, and someone answered it." Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confession hanging over him. "I've told you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "I met her to discuss the manuscript. We argued, but I left her alive." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Indeed, Sir Reginald. But let us consider the footprints in the garden. One, deep and distinct, with a worn heel, suggests a man with a limp. Colonel Harcourt, perhaps, whose war injury is well known. The other, fainter and blurred, suggests a lighter step, perhaps a woman's. These prints tell a story, but not the whole one." Colonel Harcourt's face darkened. "I was in the study, as I've said. Clara was mistaken about seeing me in the garden." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, her earlier confession weighing heavily. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she looked at the girl, but her voice remained steady. "Clara saw a shadow, an argument near the hedge. And Sir Reginald admits to being there, but there is more. The smudge of ink on the blotter, the word trust. These point to a motive beyond a simple dispute over a manuscript."
She turned to the group, her tone measured but relentless. Miss Voss was a woman of ambition, one who collected secrets as others collect jewels. She came to Ashwood Manor not merely for a weekend, but with a purpose. She was interested in the manuscript, yes, but also in the secrets of this household. And one secret, I believe, led to her death. Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the silence, sharp and defensive. "This is nonsense. You're spinning tales, Miss Marple. If anyone had a motive, it was that solicitor, always lurking with his briefcase." Mr. Crane's lips tightened, but before he could respond, Miss Marple raised a hand. "Mr. Crane's briefcase may indeed hold secrets, but let us focus on the garden. The deeper footprint matches the Colonel's shoes, but the fainter one suggests another presence. And then there is the scarf, so conveniently found in Jenkins's quarters. It was placed there.
Ink, trust, suggests a second document, perhaps a letter or agreement. I believe Miss Voss was blackmailing someone, threatening to reveal a secret tied to the manuscript's value or to a personal matter. Sir Reginald, you argued with her about the manuscript, but you were not alone in the garden." She turned to Lady Beatrice, whose face had gone pale. "Lady Beatrice, your anger has been evident, but so has your fear. You followed your brother to the garden, did you not? You overheard his argument with Miss Voss, and you feared what she might reveal, not about the manuscript, but about a family secret." Lady Beatrice gasped, a hand clutching her shawl. "How dare you! I was in the dining room all evening." But Miss Marple's gaze was unrelenting. "The fainter footprint, blurred as if to hide its maker, matches the size of your shoes, Lady Beatrice. And your protectiveness of Clara, your fury at the investigation, it suggests a mother guarding a secret. I believe Miss Voss knew something about your family, perhaps about Clara's future or a financial matter, and she threatened to expose it." Clara's sob broke the silence, and Colonel Harcourt rose, his cane trembling in his hand. "Enough!" he roared. "You're accusing my wife of murder based on a footprint. This is madness!" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Not madness, Colonel, but logic. The truth is this. Sir Reginald met Miss Voss to discuss the manuscript, but their argument drew another's attention. Lady Beatrice, you followed, fearing what Miss Voss might reveal. And when Sir Reginald left, you confronted her. The struggle was brief but fatal. You strangled her, perhaps in a moment of panic, and then you tried to cover your tracks, blurring your footprint, planting the scarf to implicate Jenkins." Lady Beatrice's face crumpled, and she sank into her chair, her hands covering her face. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She was going to ruin us. She knew about Clara's engagement, a scandal from years ago that would have destroyed her prospects. I only meant to warn her, but she laughed, taunted me. I lost control." The room was silent, the weight of her confession settling over the group like a shroud. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Lady Beatrice, I'm afraid you'll need to come with me." As the inspector led her away, Miss Marple's gaze softened. The little grey cells had done their work, piecing together the puzzle from the single footprint, the note, the smudge of ink, and the secrets of Ashwood Manor. The truth, as always, had been in the details. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The library at Ashwood Manor, once a haven of quiet scholarship, now felt like a stage after the final act. Its air heavy with the echoes. Guests scattered across the room were subdued, their faces a mix of shock, relief, and lingering unease. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, sat by the window, her serene expression belying the keen workings of her mind. The little grey cells had done their work, but the case, she knew, was not quite closed until its lessons were understood. Inspector Crane had taken Lady Beatrice into custody, her tearful admission of guilt still ringing in the ears of those present. The revelation that she had strangled Geraldine Voss in a moment of panic, driven by fear of a scandal that would ruin Clara's prospects, had stunned the household. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human nature, sensed that the ripples of this tragedy would linger long after the inspector's departure. Clara, pale and trembling, sat on a sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Colonel Harcourt, his military bearing softened by grief, stood beside her, his hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder. Sir Reginald, his face etched with sorrow, stared out of the window, as if seeking solace in the rose garden where the tragedy had unfolded. Dr. Baxter, his pipe unlit, murmured condolences, while Mr. Crane, his briefcase finally set aside, offered a rare nod of acknowledgement to Miss Marple. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, her notebook overflowing with scribbled notes, hovered nearby, her usual exuberance tempered by the weight of the moment. "Jane," Mrs. Oliver whispered, leaning close, "you were magnificent. That business with the footprint and the ink smudge, it's like something out of one of my novels, only better. How did you know it was Lady Beatrice?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes distant. "It was not a matter of knowing, Ariadne, but of seeing. In my village I have learned that people reveal themselves in the smallest ways, a glance, a word, a footprint left in haste. Lady Beatrice's fear was evident from the start, her anger a shield for something deeper. The fainter footprint, blurred as if to hide its maker, was the key. It spoke of calculation, of a woman desperate to protect her family. Mrs. Oliver's eyes widened. "And the note? The smudge of ink? You tied it all together like a perfect plot twist." Miss Marple's needles, now still, rested in her lap. "The note told us Miss Voss had a purpose, a meeting that ended in her death. The smudge, the word trust, suggested a secret tied to the family, perhaps a financial or personal matter. Lady Beatrice's reaction to Clara's distress confirmed it. She acted not out of malice, but out of a mother's fear, a fear that drove her to a terrible act." Sir Reginald, overhearing, turned from the window, his voice heavy. "Miss Marple, I owe you my thanks and my apologies. I should have been more forthcoming about Geraldine's interest in the manuscript. I never imagined it would lead to this." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You could not have
known, Sir Reginald. Miss Voss was a woman who stirred passions and secrets wherever she went. Her death was a tragedy, but it was born of choices, hers and others. Clara, her voice, barely a whisper, spoke at last.
"I should have told the truth sooner. If I hadn't been so afraid, perhaps Mother wouldn't have—"
Miss Marple's gaze softened. "My dear, fear is a powerful force, but so is truth. You spoke when it mattered, and that took courage. Your mother's actions were her own, driven by her love for you, however misguided." Colonel Harcourt cleared his throat, his eyes glistening. "Beatrice thought she was protecting us all. I should have seen her distress, stopped her, somehow." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "We cannot undo the past, Colonel, but we can learn from it. In my experience, secrets, when buried, grow heavy. It is better to let them see the light." As the group fell silent, Inspector Crane re-entered the room, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Miss Marple," he said, "your insight has been invaluable. Lady Beatrice has made a full confession. She acted alone, driven by fear that Miss Voss would expose a past indiscretion that would ruin Clara's engagement. The scarf was indeed planted to implicate Jenkins, a desperate attempt to divert suspicion." Miss Marple nodded, her mind revisiting the clues, the deep footprint, mistakenly attributed to the colonel due to his limp, the fainter print, Lady Beatrice's attempt to cover her tracks, the note, a lure for a fatal meeting, the smudge of ink, a hint of the trust betrayed. It was a pattern she had seen before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where human nature was as complex as any man's secrets. As the inspector prepared to depart, Miss Marple rose, her small figure unassuming yet resolute. "I shall return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow," she said, addressing the group. "But I leave you with a thought. The truth, however painful, is a kinder burden than a lie. Cherish the honesty of those around you, and you may avoid such tragedies in the future." With that, she bid them good night, her steps light as she made her way to her room. Mrs. Oliver followed, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Jane, you must let me put this in a novel. A single footprint, a smudge of ink. It's too perfect." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Write your novel, Ariadne, but remember, the real story is always in the people, not the clues." As she closed her door, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the rose garden, where a single footprint had told a tale of desperation and betrayal. The little grey cells, satisfied, rested at last, but she knew they would be ready for the next puzzle. For in the quiet corners of human life, mysteries were never far away. Chapter 12. The Unsettled Dust. The morning following Lady Beatrice's confession dawned grey and heavy over Ashwood Manor,
Unraveling of its secrets. The rose garden, now cordoned off by Inspector Crane's orders, lay silent, its beauty marred by the memory of Geraldine Voss's death. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was one of fragile calm, the guests moving through their routines with the cautious tread of those who know the ground beneath them has shifted. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table with her cup of tea, observed the group with her usual quiet acuity, her knitting needles resting in her lap. The little grey cells, though satisfied with the resolution of the murder, were still alert, sensing that not all questions had been answered.
"Jane," Mrs. Oliver said, leaning across the table, "you've outdone yourself this time. A single footprint. It's positively poetic. But tell me, are you sure there's nothing more to it? I keep thinking there's another twist, like in my death in the orchard." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Ariadne, your imagination is a marvel, but sometimes the truth is simpler than we wish. Lady Beatrice acted out of fear for her daughter's future, and the clues, the footprint, the note, the smudge of ink, pointed to her. Yet," she paused, her gaze drifting to the window, "there are always loose threads in human affairs, and I confess, one or two still trouble me." Her words were cut short by the arrival of Inspector Crane, who entered the dining room with a purposeful stride. "Good morning," he said, his grey eyes sweeping the group. "I've just come from speaking with Lady Beatrice. She's been cooperative, and we'll be taking her to Exeter this afternoon. But there's a matter I'd like to clarify, and I thought Miss Marple might assist." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene but alert. "Of course, Inspector. What troubles you?" The inspector hesitated, glancing at the guests. "It's about the manuscript. Lady Beatrice insists she knew nothing of Miss Voss's interest in it. Yet, Sir Reginald mentioned their argument. I'm wondering if there's more to the manuscript's role in this affair." Sir Reginald looked up, his face pale. "I've told you everything, Inspector. Geraldine wanted to broker a sale to a collector. I refused. That's all there was to it."
Miss Marple's needles, though still, seemed to hum with the rhythm of her thoughts. The manuscript had been a recurring thread in the case, its value a potential motive. Yet Lady Beatrice's confession had centered on a personal scandal, not a financial one. The smudge of ink, the word trust, these suggested a deeper connection, perhaps not to the manuscript itself, but to what it represented. She recalled Mr. Crane's guarded demeanor, his ever-present briefcase, and a new possibility began to form. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might I suggest we examine Mr. Crane's role more closely? As Sir Reginald's solicitor, he would have knowledge of the manuscript's value and any legal matters tied to it. Perhaps he can shed light on Miss Voss's intentions." Mr. Crane's head snapped up, his calm facade cracking for the first time. "I've already told you, Miss Marple, my papers are routine. I had no dealings with Miss Voss beyond polite conversation." But Miss Marple's gaze was unrelenting. "And yet, Mr. Crane,
You arrived at Ashwood Manor on the very day of the murder, with a briefcase you guard as if it holds the crown jewels. In my experience, such caution often hides a secret. Might it be related to a trust, perhaps one tied to the Harcourt family? The room fell silent, all eyes on Mr. Crane. His fingers twitched, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of protest. Then, with a sigh, he reached for his briefcase, which had been left in the library overnight. "Very well," he said, his voice low. "There is a trust, a financial arrangement set up by Sir Reginald's late wife for Clara's future. Miss Voss had learned of it, through means I don't fully understand, and she hinted at exposing irregularities in its management. I was here to discuss it with Sir Reginald, to ensure it remained secure." Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Irregularities? What does that mean?" Sir Reginald's face darkened. "It means nothing, Clara. Your mother's trust is safe. Geraldine was fishing, trying to stir trouble. I told her to drop it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind piecing together the final threads. The smudge of ink, the word trust. It was not merely a clue to Lady Beatrice's motive, but a hint at a broader web of secrets. Geraldine had been probing, using her charm to uncover vulnerabilities in the Harcourt family. Lady Beatrice had acted to protect Clara's reputation, but Mr. Crane's role suggested a financial motive that had simmered beneath the surface. "Mr. Crane," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm, "did Miss Voss approach you directly about the trust, or did you learn of her inquiries through another?" Mr. Crane hesitated, then nodded.
"But I never imagined." His words trailed off, but Miss Marple needed no more. The picture was clear. Geraldine had been a catalyst, stirring up secrets that threatened the Harcourt stability. Lady Beatrice, driven by maternal instinct, had silenced her, but the trust's irregularities hinted at a motive that might have implicated others. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she looked at Clara, whose future had been the heart of this tragedy. "Inspector," she said, "I believe you have all you need. Lady Beatrice's confession stands, but Mr. Crane's disclosure clarifies the stakes. Miss Voss was a woman who saw opportunity in others' secrets, and it cost her her life." Inspector Crane nodded, his expression one of respect. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your insight has been invaluable, as always." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the fragility of trust, both the financial kind and the human. The little grey cells had unravelled the mystery, but the cost, she knew, would linger in the hearts of those at Ashwood Manor. Chapter 13. The Weight of Truth. The grey morning light lingered over Ashwood Manor, casting a sombre pall over the estate, as the household grappled with the aftermath of Lady Beatrice's confession and Mr. Crane's revelations. The dining room, where breakfast had been a strained affair, was now nearly empty, the guests retreating to their rooms or the library to process the events. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window with her tea, gazed out at the rose garden, where the single footprint had first caught her attention. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, a rare occurrence, as her mind sifted through the final threads of the mystery. The little grey cells, though satisfied with the resolution of Geraldine Voss's murder, was still alert to the undercurrents of unease that rippled through the manor. Clara Harcourt, her face pale but composed, sat across from Miss Marple, stirring her tea absently. The girl's confession about her father's presence in the garden and Mr. Crane's disclosure about the trust had lifted a weight from her shoulders, but her eyes still held a shadow of guilt. Colonel Harcourt, absent from breakfast, had taken to pacing the grounds, his limp more pronounced under the strain of his wife's arrest. Sir Reginald, meanwhile, had retreated to his study, ostensibly to review papers with Mr. Crane, though Miss Marple suspected he sought solitude to mourn both Geraldine and his sister's downfall. Dr. Baxter, ever the physician, busied himself checking on the household, while Mrs. Ariadne Oliver flitted about, her notebook brimming with ideas inspired by the case.
Jane, Mrs. Oliver said, settling beside me. Of Mr. Crane's story. Do you think there's more to the trust? Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes thoughtful. There is always more to human affairs, Ariadne, but not always in the way we expect. Mr. Crane's disclosure explains Miss Foss's interest. She was probing for weaknesses, as was her nature. The trust, with its irregularities, was a lever she hoped to pull. But it was Lady Beatrice's fear for Clara's future that drove her to act, not the manuscript or the money. Mrs. Oliver's eyes gleamed. But what about the Colonel? Clara saw him in the garden arguing. Could he have been involved? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the rose garden lay quiet under the grey sky. The Colonel's presence is a thread we must tie off. His footprint, with its worn heel, was indeed in the garden, but I believe he was there earlier, perhaps confronting Geraldine about her intentions. Lady Beatrice, overhearing, acted later, in a moment of desperation. The fainter print, blurred to hide its maker, was hers. As if summoned by their conversation, Colonel Harcourt appeared at the dining-room door, his face haggard.
Miss Marple,
He said, his voice rough, "May I have a word?" Miss Marple nodded, gesturing to a chair. "Of course, Colonel. Please sit." He hesitated, then sat, his cane resting against the table.
Clara told me what she said about seeing me in the garden. I owe you the truth. I did go out there just after 8:15.
Geraldine had been asking questions about Clara's trust, hinting at some scandal. I told her to leave it alone, that it was family business. We argued, but I swear I left her alive. I went back to the study through the back gate. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind was alert. "And did anyone see you return, Colonel?" He shook his head. "No, I was alone. But I heard Beatrice go out later. She said she was checking on the roses. I thought nothing of it until Clara found the body. Miss Marple's needles, though still, seemed to hum with the rhythm of her thoughts." The Colonel's story aligned with the timeline. Geraldine's note at 8:30, Clara's discovery at 9, the deeper footprint matching his limp. Lady Beatrice, following her husband, had likely overheard the argument and confronted Geraldine herself, leading to the fatal struggle. The fainter print, blurred by careful steps, was her attempt to cover her tracks. "Thank you, Colonel," Miss Marple said softly. "Your honesty helps clarify the picture. You were not the killer, but your presence in the garden set the stage for tragedy." The Colonel's shoulders slumped, relief mingling with guilt. "If I'd stayed with her or told Beatrice to stay inside, perhaps this wouldn't have happened. Clara will need your strength now." As the Colonel nodded, his eyes glistening, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the trust. Mr. Crane's disclosure had hinted at irregularities, but she suspected they were minor, perhaps an administrative oversight rather than a crime. Geraldine, however, had seen opportunity in exploiting them, using her charm to unsettle the family. It was a pattern Miss Marple had seen before, in the quiet intrigues of St. Mary Mead, where ambition often led to ruin. Mrs. Oliver, unable to contain herself, broke in. "Jane, you're leaving out the best part. The scarf in Jenkins's quarters, pure genius on Lady Beatrice's part, a perfect red herring."
Miss Marple's smile was faint. Indeed, Ariadne, but red herrings only work until the truth is seen clearly. The scarf was a desperate act. Like the blurred footprint, Lady Beatrice hoped to shift blame, but the little grey cells saw through it. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple excused herself and wandered to the library where the Canterbury Tales manuscript lay. She stood before it, her mind reflecting on the power of secrets, those written in ink, those pressed into grass, those buried in the heart. The case was solved, but its lessons lingered. Trust, once broken, could lead to tragedy, but truth, however painful, could set one free. Chapter 14. The Final Threads. The grey morning had given way to a soft drizzle, the gentle patter of rain against the windows of Ashwood Manor adding a melancholic note to the already sombre atmosphere. The rose garden, visible through the library's tall windows, seemed to mourn in silence, its beauty dimmed by the memory of Geraldine Voss's death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting once again in her hands, observed the remaining guests with her quiet, penetrating gaze. The little grey cells, though content with the resolution of the murder, were still weaving the final threads of the case, ensuring no detail was left unravelled. The household was quieter now, the initial shock of Lady Beatrice's confession giving way to a resigned acceptance. Inspector Crane had departed with Lady Beatrice for Exeter, where she would face formal charges. Clara, though still fragile, had found a measure of strength in her father's presence, and Colonel Harcourt, despite his grief, was making an effort to support her. Sir Reginald, however, remained withdrawn, his usual warmth replaced by a heavy silence. Dr. Baxter busied himself with small tasks, while Mr. Crane, his briefcase now less guarded, prepared to return to London. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, ever the whirlwind, was already planning her departure, her notebook brimming with ideas for a novel inspired by the case. "Jane," Mrs. Oliver said.
"Sure there's nothing more? I keep feeling there's one last twist, something we've overlooked." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile serene but tinged with amusement. "Ariadne, your flair for drama is unmatched, but the truth is often simpler than we imagine. Lady Beatrice acted to protect Clara's future, driven by fear of a scandal Geraldine threatened to expose. The footprints, the note, the smudge of ink, all pointed to her. Yet I confess, one small detail still nags at me." Mrs. Oliver's eyes widened, her pencil poised. "A detail? Oh, do tell, Jane. Is it about the trust? Or Mr. Crane? He's been far too quiet for my liking." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the Canterbury Tales manuscript, still resting on its velvet table. The trust, yes. Mr. Crane's disclosure about its irregularities was significant, but I suspect there is more to his role than he has admitted. Not as a murderer, perhaps, but as a keeper of secrets. As if on cue, Mr. Crane entered the library, his expression composed, but his eyes wary. "Miss Marple," he said, inclining his head, "I understand you've been instrumental in resolving this tragedy. I'm preparing to leave, but is there anything more you require of me?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but probing. "Only a moment of your time, Mr. Crane. The trust you mentioned, Clara's inheritance from her mother, has irregularities, you said. Might you clarify what those are? Miss Voss's interest in it suggests she saw an opportunity, and I wonder if you knew more than you've shared." Mr. Crane's lips tightened, and for a moment he seemed to weigh his response. Then, with a sigh, he sat opposite her. "You're perceptive, Miss Marple. The trust is sound legally, but there were discrepancies in its documentation. minor errors, nothing criminal, but enough to raise questions if made public. Miss Voss learned of them, how, I'm not certain, and hinted she could exploit them to pressure Sir Reginald. I came to Ashwood to address the matter discreetly, to protect the family's reputation. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained kind. And did you discuss this with Miss Voss directly? Or did you perhaps warn Lady Beatrice of her inquiries? Mr. Crane hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of his briefcase. I mentioned it to Lady Beatrice in passing before dinner. I thought she should know, as Clara's mother. I had no idea it would lead to such a tragedy. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind fitting this new piece into the puzzle. Lady Beatrice's fear, already heightened by Geraldine's probing, had been inflamed by Mr. Crane's warning. It was the final spark that drove her to confront Geraldine in the garden, resulting in the
Protect the family, Mr. Crane. But secrets have a way of escaping their bounds. Your candor now is appreciated. Clara, who had entered the library unnoticed, overheard the exchange and stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. Mr. Crane, did Mother know about these discrepancies? Is that why she did what she did? Mr. Crane's face softened, a rare glimpse of empathy breaking through his reserve. Miss Harcourt, your mother acted out of love for you. She feared Miss Voss would ruin your engagement, your future. The trust was a minor issue, but Geraldine's threats made it seem larger. I'm sorry for my part in it. Clara nodded, tears in her eyes, but her expression was one of resolve. Thank you for telling me. I need to know everything to understand why this happened. Miss Marple's gaze was warm but discerning. You are stronger than you know, Clara. The truth, however painful, will help you heal. As Mr. Crane excused himself to prepare for his departure, Mrs. Oliver leaned close, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Jane, you've done it again. You teased out that last bit about the trust like a master. But tell me, is that really the end of it? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. For now, Ariadne, the murder is solved, the motives laid bare, but human nature is never quite finished revealing itself. In my village, I've seen how secrets linger, shaping lives long after the truth is known. As the drizzle outside thickened into rain, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. She would leave Ashwood Manor tomorrow, returning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. But the lessons of this case, the fragility of trust, the weight of fear, would remain with her. The single footprint, so small a clue, had led to a truth that reshaped a family, and Miss Marple, with a quiet wisdom, had been its guide. Chapter 15. The Quiet Departure. The rain had ceased by the morning of Miss Jane Marple's departure from Ashwood Manor, leaving the Devon countryside washed clean and glistening under a tentative sun. The rose garden, though still cordoned off, seemed to breathe a little easier, its beauty slowly reclaiming the space where tragedy had struck. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was one of fragile recovery, the guests preparing to resume their lives forever altered by the events of the past days. Miss Marple, a small suitcase packed and a knitting bag at her side, stood in the grand hall, her serene presence a quiet anchor amidst the lingering ripples of the case. The household had gathered to bid her farewell, their faces a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. Clara Harcourt, her eyes clearer now.
Dr. Baxter, his pipe now lit, murmured a kind farewell, while Mr. Crane, his briefcase less guarded, extended a formal handshake. Mrs. Ariadne Oliver, ever the whirlwind, was already planning her next visit to St. Mary Mead.
her notebook brimming with ideas for a novel inspired by the case.
"Jane," Mrs. Oliver said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm, "you simply must let me visit soon. I've got the whole plot worked out. A mysterious footprint, a hidden note, a scandalous trust. I'll call it The Riddle of the Rose, and you'll be my muse."
Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling with amusement.
"Ariadne, you do me too much credit, but I shall look forward to reading your novel, provided you keep the truth at its heart. People, you know, are always more complex than plots."
Sir Reginald stepped forward, his silver hair catching the light. "Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough. Your insight brought justice to Geraldine and clarity to our troubled house. I only wish it had not come at such a cost." Miss Marple's gaze was kind but discerning.
"Justice, Sir Reginald, is often a heavy burden, but it is lighter than the weight of secrets. You and Clara will rebuild, with time and honesty." Clara, her voice steady despite her grief, spoke up. "Miss Marple, you've given me courage. I was so afraid to speak, but you showed me that the truth, even when it hurts, is the only way forward." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You have strength, my dear, more than you know. Trust in it, and in those who love you." As the group exchanged final farewells, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the rose garden, where a single footprint had sparked the unravelling of a deadly mystery. The deeper print, with its worn heel, had pointed to Colonel Harcourt's presence, a red herring that masked Lady Beatrice's desperate act. The fainter print, blurred by careful steps, had revealed her attempt to hide her guilt. The note, the smudge of ink, the word trust, each had been a thread in a tapestry of fear, ambition, and betrayal, woven together by the little grey cells. The car to take her to the station arrived, and Miss Marple stepped into the hall, her small figure silhouetted against the open door. The Canterbury Tales manuscript, still in the library, seemed a fitting symbol of the case, a treasure coveted by many, yet tainted by the secrets it had stirred. Geraldine Voss, with her charm and cunning, had sought to exploit those secrets, only to meet her end in the quiet beauty of the garden. Lady Beatrice, driven by a mother's love, had paid the ultimate price for her silence. As the car pulled away, Miss Marple gazed out at the rolling hills, her mind reflecting on the lessons of Ashwood Manor. In her village of St. Mary Mead, she had seen such dramas play out on a smaller scale. Jealousies, fears, hidden truths that shaped lives in quiet ways. The single footprint had
been a small clue, easily overlooked, but it had led to a truth that set a family free, however painfully. Mrs. Oliver, who had insisted on accompanying her to the station, chattered on about her novel, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. "The little grey cells," she murmured almost to herself. "They see what others miss. A footprint, a word, a glance. These are the keys to the human heart." As the train whistle sounded in the distance, Miss Marple settled back, her knitting bag at her side, ready to return to the quiet rhythms of St. Mary Mead. But she knew, with a certainty born of experience, that another mystery would find her soon enough. For wherever there were people, there were secrets. And where there were secrets, Miss Marple's little grey cells would always be at work.